Was the Cowichan case wrongly decided? Hello, my name is Michelle Sterling. I'm an independent researcher. A fellow independent researcher named Nina Green has done a detailed review of the Cowichan ruling and has found some additional historical information, which is important to the case. I offered to narrate her PowerPoint for you simply because sometimes it's easier to understand these complex legal issues and historical issues when there's also a spoken word version. So let me proceed with her work. Was the Cowichan case wrongly decided? Cowichan tribe's decision shocks the country. The BC Supreme Court Cowichan tribe's decision, released on the 7th of August 2025, shocked Canadians with its declaration that Aboriginal title exists over private properties on Lulu Island on the south arm of the Fraser River in Richmond, BC, where the Cowichan claim to have had a summer fishing village called Tluktinas. Even more shocking was that Madam Justice Young went out of her way to declare that her decision set a sweeping precedent. A precedent that will follow from this case is that provincial Crown grants of fee simple interest do not extinguish nor permanently displace Aboriginal title, and Sections 23 and 25 of the Land Titles Act do not apply to Aboriginal title. So for those of you who are not familiar with the area, this is a map showing the area in question and a description from Wikipedia. Lulu Island is the name of the largest island in the estuary of the Fraser River, located south of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and the second most populous island in British Columbia after Vancouver Island. The city of Richmond occupies most of the island, while a small section at the eastern tip, known as Queensborough, is part of the city of New Westminster. So the estimated 2025 population of Richmond is about 250,000 people. So how did the court reach the conclusion that Cowichan held Aboriginal title to private property? What were the key issues in the case? What evidence did the court accept as proof of those key issues? And was the case wrongly decided? Two key issues stand out. One, the Cowichan tribe argued these two key issues. Number one, they hold Aboriginal title over properties on Lulu Island in Richmond, on which they claim to have had exclusive possession of a large summer fishing village named Tluktinas in 1846, at the time British sovereignty was asserted over what is now British Columbia. And two, they were unjustly deprived of possession of Tluktinas because the honor of the Crown was breached when Sir James Douglas failed to mark out a reserve for them at Tluktinas in 1861 and allowed Colonel Richard Moody to covertly purchase sections 27 and 34 of the claim area in September of 1863. Two key issues stand out. Continued. How did the court decide that these two key issues were proved to its satisfaction? Well, let's start with the test used as proof of Aboriginal title, keeping in mind that potential Aboriginal title claims cover almost the entire province of British Columbia because it has few historic treaties. And here you can see this map of Canada's treaties. You can see most of the country is covered by historic treaties, with BC having very few treaties. Proof of Aboriginal title. In paragraph 530, Madam Justice Young stated that in order to prove Aboriginal title, the claimant group must show that it occupied the lands at the time the Crown first asserted sovereignty in 1846. In paragraph 557, she found that the group must have had the intention and capacity to retain exclusive control over the lands. In paragraph 560, she asserted that evidence of an indigenous group's reputation of fierceness can support a finding that they had the capacity to exclude others. In paragraph 561, she stated that in the Chilcotin case, for example, evidence was led about the Chilcotins' military practices, such as killing all but a few opponents and allowing the survivors to spread the message of their warriors' fierceness, and that non-Chilcotin in Aboriginal guides refused to enter Chilcotin territory, expressing fear of Chilcotin people. In paragraph 599, she wrote that legal counsel for Canada had raised the question of whether that line of reasoning was legally sound. In what circumstances, if any, is the acquisition of territory by violence, force of arms, and intimidation a legally sound basis for resolving competing Aboriginal title claims in modern Canadian Aboriginal law? Proof of Aboriginal title continued. Undeterred by legal counsel for Canada's question as to whether evidence of the Cowichan's intertribal warfare and barbaric violence was a legally sound basis for proving their existence, or for proving their exclusive possession of Clutinas, Madam Justice Young accepted the following evidence. Paragraph 714. Councillor Thomas was taught the story by August Sylvester that one day the warriors in Clutinas got together and went to the Musqueam village. They killed the chief and took his head. Paragraph 715. Lucium's grandfather taught him a story of pre-contact Cowichan warriors. His people were around Bonsall Creek at Susi. People from the north, the Haida, came to raid their village, so they gathered family from the Cowichan River, surrounded the warriors, and massacred them. They put their heads on sticks around the front of Susi to warn any others that this could happen to them. In paragraph 1282, Elder Florence James was taught that Milukwa is what would happen to people if captured. Warriors would cut a person's head off to show they could not come to this territory. And in paragraph 1299, on October 18, 1827, Shashia led a war party of Cowichans and Musqueam to attack the Chilliwack. The war party returned downriver the next day, having killed 2 Sumas and taken several prisoners to become slaves. Barnston observed the Cowichan party passing Fort Langley. The head of one of their victims was pendant at the bow of the largest canoe, presenting a spectacle as dismal and disgusting as can well be imagined. A spectacle the most shocking to humanity that this land of barbarism can well produce. The Supreme Court of Canada test for Aboriginal title is a national disgrace. As exemplified by the Cowichan tribe's decision, the Supreme Court of Canada test for Aboriginal title is whether a tribe's warfare and barbarous act of violence and deterrence against other tribes, including decapitation, display of human heads on poles, and the taking of slaves, created sufficient terror in 1846 to give the Cowichan exclusive possession of the lands they now claim. A test which rewards intertribal warfare, slavery, decapitation, and barbaric violence in the past with grants of Aboriginal title is morally repugnant in a modern democracy. The second issue, key issue, breach of the honor of the Crown and nefarious dealing. The second key issue in the Cowichan case is Madam Justice Young's finding that the honor of the Crown was engaged by Sir James Douglas in 1853 and was breached in 1861 when Governor Douglas and Colonel Richard Moody failed to mark out a reserve at Clutinas, thus unfairly and nefariously depriving the Cowichan of possession of their summer fishing village. The historical events described in the next few slides provide a timeline against which to assess the evidence accepted by Madam Justice Young that the honour of the Crown was engaged and then breached by Douglas and Moody's nefarious dealing. Historical context. The pivotal date in the Cowichan case is 1846. The Oregon Treaty of the 15th of June, 1846, with the United States gave Britain sole ownership of Vancouver Island and the area on the mainland north of the 49th parallel. So here is Vancouver Island, and here is the 49th parallel. So Britain received sole ownership of all of this in the Oregon Treaty. To establish Aboriginal title, the Cowichan, whose primary villages were on Vancouver Island, had to prove that they had exclusive possession of Tlutinus on the mainland in 1846. So the map shows in light yellow the former Oregon Territory shared by Britain and the U.S. until 1846, and this arrow points to Vancouver Island. Historical context. To solidify its hold on the territory it had acquired under the Oregon Treaty of 1846, on the 13th of January 1849, Britain leased Vancouver Island to the Hudson Bay Company in return for the company's promise to create a settlement of resident colonists from Britain. The expense of the new Vancouver Island colony was to be largely financed by the sale of land to settlers. Richard Blanchard was appointed governor in July of 1849. He was succeeded as governor in May of 1851 by the Hudson Bay Company's chief factor, Sir James Douglas. As chief factor, Douglas also had administrative oversight over the Hudson Bay Company's operation on the mainland, but no authority on the mainland on behalf of the British Crown. The situation on the mainland changed almost overnight in 1858 when gold was found in the Fraser Canyon. Thousands of American prospectors flooded to the area. Fearing that the influx of Americans posed a threat to British sovereignty, on the 2nd of August 1858, the British Parliament passed an act establishing the Crown Colony of British Columbia on the mainland. The act was not proclaimed until November the 19th, 1858. Sir James Douglas was appointed governor of the mainland colony, while at the same time remaining governor of Vancouver Island. The objective of the creation of a new colony on the mainland was to settle the area with colonists from Britain as a bulwark against possible annexation by the United States. And here's an ad from the time. Got the gold fever and bound for Fraser River? So Quincy Hall Clothing House is selling out. So on the 19th of November, 1858, Sir James Douglas proclaimed the British Parliament's Act to provide for the government of British Columbia and his appointment as governor of the new colony of British Columbia. On the 2nd of December, 1858, Douglas issued a further proclamation giving himself power to grant all Crown land in the new colony of British Columbia the title to be valid as against the Crown. To maintain order, build infrastructure, and survey the new colony on the mainland for settlement, Britain sent Colonel Richard Clement Moody as Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works in charge of a detachment of Royal Engineers. The cost of maintaining the Royal Engineers was to be defrayed by the sale of surveyed lands on the mainland. Colonel Moody arrived at Victoria on the 25th of December, 1858, and was sworn in as Lieutenant Governor and Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works on the 4th of January, 1859. The Royal Engineers immediately set to work maintaining order, surveying land for sale to settlers, building roads and bridges, and establishing a capital city for the new colony at New Westminster, originally called Queensborough, on the Fraser River. Shortly after Moody's arrival, Governor Douglas issued a proclamation on the 14th of February, 1859, stating that all land in the new mainland colony of British Columbia belonged to the Crown in fee, and that once surveyed, all land must immediately be put up for sale at public auction. If the surveyed lands failed to attract buyers at public auction, they could then legally be sold privately to anyone who cared to buy them. The honor of the Crown was not engaged in 1853. The Supreme Court of Canada has determined that Section 35 of the Constitution, enacted in 1982, requires the Crown to act honorably in its dealings with Aboriginal people. Madam Justice Young held that the honor of the Crown was engaged vis-a-vis the Crown's dealings with the Cowichan concerning Clutinus in January 1853, when Sir James Douglas, then Governor of Vancouver Island, led a military expedition to force the Cowichan and Nanaimo tribes on Vancouver Island to hand over 2 murderers. In a letter on the 21st of January, 1853, Douglas reported the success of the military expedition to Sir John Pakington in London. Douglas emphasized that his intent was to impress on the chiefs of the Cowichan and Nanaimo tribes that under British justice, legal recourse would only be taken against the 2 murderers, a concept the chiefs found difficult to understand. The point at which I principally aimed in my various communications on the subject of the murder with the chiefs of those tribes was to impress upon their minds that the terrors of the law should be let loose on the perpetrators only, and on no other members of the tribe, except such as should be found resisting the Queen's authority and protecting him from justice. But that was a matter so different from their own customs in such cases, and so foreign to their ideas of propriety, that it was exceedingly difficult to make them comprehend our views. And here's a copy of that letter to Sir John Pakington from the 21st of January, 1853. The honor of the Crown was not engaged in 1853, continued. Ignoring Douglas' statement to Sir John Pakington that his intention was to impress the principles of British justice on Indian chiefs who could not comprehend them, Madam Justice Young held that an entry Douglas made in his journal concerning this military expedition on Vancouver Island constituted a solemn promise which engaged the honor of the Crown concerning the Cowichan tribe's summer fishing village of Clutinus on the mainland. In paragraph 6, she wrote, "In 1853, Governor Douglas told the Cowichan that the Queen had given him a special charge to treat them with justice and humanity so long as they remained at peace with the settlements. This was a solemn promise that engaged the honor of the Crown, which is a constitutional principle that requires the Crown to act honorably in its dealing with Aboriginal peoples." Madam Justice Young relied on this entry in Douglas's journal to such an extent that she refers to Douglas' promise to treat the Cowichan with justice and humanity 17 times and refers to the phrase honor of the Crown almost 100 times in her decision. And this is Madam Justice Young's reference to Douglas' journal entry. Honor of the Crown was not engaged in 1853, continued. Madam Justice Young's reliance on Douglas' journal entry raises questions in that it appears Douglas' original 1853 journal no longer exists, and Douglas spoke to the Cowichan in Chinook jargon, not English, so his journal entry is at best a paraphrase of his speech to the Cowichan. Moreover, in finding that Douglas engaged the honor of the Crown in 1853 with regard to Cowichan's summer fishing village of Clutinus on the mainland, Madam Justice Young ignored the fact that Douglas had no authority over the mainland in 1853 other than as chief factor of the Hudson Bay Company, and was thus legally unable to engage the honor of the Crown with respect to the mainland. In paragraph 1728, Madam Justice Young brushed that legal reality aside. In 1728, the paragraph says that the mainland colony was not yet established is not an impediment to this interpretation. Not only did Madam Justice Young brush aside the legal reality that Governor Douglas had no authority to engage the honor of the Crown with respect to the mainland, and that his promise falls short of a constitutional commitment, but she also acknowledged that there was no evidence before her as to whether the Cowichan understood Douglas' statement to relate to Clutinus. In paragraph 1729, she wrote, "There is an absence of evidence about what the Cowichan understood Douglas' assurance to relate to." In short, Madam Justice Young appears to have had no evidence before her to support a finding that Douglas had engaged the honor of the Crown during a military expedition to apprehend two murderers in 1853. In consequence, Douglas' failure to mark out a reserve for the Cowichan at Clutinus in 1861 was not a breach of the honor of the Crown, and the Cowichan had no legal basis for claiming Aboriginal title to the land in Richmond. The court's implication of nefarious dealing on the part of Colonel Moody. Proceeding incorrectly on the basis that the honor of the Crown had been engaged in 1853, Madam Justice Young found that Sir James Douglas had appropriated what she called Indian settlement lands for Indian reserves, and that Colonel Moody had failed to mark out an Indian reserve at Clutinus in 1861 as mandated by Douglas, and had covertly purchased sections 27 and 34 of Clutinus lands himself in September of 1863, prior to the lands having been put up for sale at public auction. These implications of nefarious dealing form the basis for Madam Justice Young's declaration of Aboriginal title, but they're not supported by the evidence before her. Did Douglas, Moody, and Trutch act dishonorably? As noted, Madam Justice Young appears to have been in error when she found that Sir James Douglas had engaged the honor of the Crown in 1853, and that there had therefore been a breach of the honor of the Crown when Douglas did not ensure that a reserve was marked out for the Cowichan at Clutinus in 1861. And allowed Colonel Richard Moody to purchase sections 27 and 34 in the Cowichan claim area at Clutinus in September of 1863. But even if the honor of the Crown had actually been engaged by Douglas in 1853, the timeline of subsequent events demonstrates that there was no breach of the honor of the Crown, and that Governor Douglas, Colonel Moody, and Surveyor Joseph William Trutch all acted honorably. Let's begin with the Trutch Survey of 1859. The 1859 Trutch Survey. Moody's Royal Engineers were stretched too thin to complete all the survey work required in the new colony on the mainland, and in 1859 Moody hired private individuals to survey land to be put up for sale to settlers. Joseph Trutch arrived in the colony in June of 1859 and was hired to survey Lulu Island, that summer. And here Joseph Trutch certifies the 1859 survey of Lulu Island done under his supervision. The Trutch Survey Map. Part of the area on Lulu Island surveyed by Trutch and his team in the summer of 1859 is the area now claimed by the Cowichan as their seasonal fishing village of Clutinas on the south arm of the Fraser River. Sections 134, Block 4 North, Range 5 West are all within the Cowichan claim area. See the Trutch Survey Map. In a small portion of Section 23 near the Fraser River are the words Indian Village and a sketch of 2 tent-like structures. 2 additional sections, 18 and 19, in Block 4 North, Range 4 West, are also in the claim area. So this is the Trutch map, and here's an arrow pointing to the Indian Village in a small portion of Section 23. The Indian Village marked by 2 tent-like structures in 1859 Trutch survey. The Indian Village noted by Trutch occupied only a small portion of Section 23 near the bank of the Fraser River, as indicated by 2 tent-like structures in the close-up of the survey map shown at the right. You can see these little points here. Trutch also noted a fishing station on the bank a short distance upstream and 2 trails branching out from the village. So this is a close-up of the previous map. The Indian Village and fishing station noted in the 1859 Trutch survey occupied only a small portion of Section 23 near the river. 2 Indian trails noted by Trutch branched out from Section 23 into Sections 22, 26, and 27. Sections 22, 23, 26, and 27 are the only sections showing any evidence of Indian occupation in the 1859 Trutch survey, yet the Cowichan claim 1,800 acres. The court failed to determine whether there had been a public auction prior to Moody's purchase. After Lulu Island was surveyed by Joseph Trutch and his team in the summer of 1859, the surveyed lands had to be put up for sale immediately in accordance with Governor Douglas' proclamation of the 14th of February, 1859. In order to prove that the honor of the Crown had been breached and that Colonel Moody had illegally purchased Sections 27 and 34, the court had to make a finding of fact that there had been no public auction prior to Moody's purchase. The court failed to make that crucial finding. The court made a finding of fact that there had not been time to put up the lands for sale at the public auction held on the 5th and 6th of October, 1859, but failed to make a finding as to whether the surveyed lands had been put up for sale at a subsequent public auction, i.e., a public auction held between the 5th and 6th of October, 1859, and the 8th of September, 1863, the date that Colonel Moody purchased Sections 27 and 34. The Cowichan claim lands put up for a public auction on the 9th of February, 1861. In fact, in compliance with Governor Douglas' proclamation of the 14th of February, 1859, a public auction was held on the 9th of February, 1861, of the lands on Lulu Island, surveyed by Trutch and his team. A sale book in the BC archives establishes that there were no bidders for any of the lands at that public auction. The lands were thus legally available for private sale to anyone who cared to buy them, including Colonel Moody. And here's the sale book recording public auction of Cowichan claim lands on the 9th of February, 1861. Moody purchased Sections 27 and 34 2.5 years after they had been legally put up for sale at public auction. 4 years after the 1859 Trutch survey, and 2.5 years after the surveyed lands had been legally put up for sale at public auction on the 9th of February 1861, Colonel Moody privately and legally purchased Sections 27 and 34, Block 4 North, Range 5 West, lands in the Cowichan claim area through a reputable agent, John Cochrane. As the document at the right shows, Cochrane made 3 purchases for Moody on the 8th of September 1863, Sections 27 and 34 in the Cowichan claim area, as well as lands in the west side of the Pitt River and lands in Pitt Meadows. Moody had purchased more than 3,000 acres before he left BC for England on the 11th of November 1863, when the Royal Engineers were recalled. So here's Cochrane's 3 purchases for Moody in September of 1863. You can see J.J. Cochrane, ditto, ditto. Moody purchased Sections 27 and 34 2.5 years after they had been legally put up for sale at public auction. Moody had purchased more than 3,000 acres before he left BC for England on the 11th of November 1863, when the Royal Engineers were recalled. Sections 27 and 34 in the Cowichan claim area comprised 125 acres and were a very small part of his land acquisitions. So these are some of Moody's land purchases in British Columbia. And here's a map accompanying the Crown grant of Sections 27 and 34 purchased by Moody on the 8th of September 1863. When did Governor Douglas issue instructions concerning the marking out of Indian reserves? It was not until March of 1861, a month after the lands on Lulu Island, surveyed by Trutch, had been legally offered for sale at public auction, as required by Governor Douglas' proclamation of the 14th of February 1859, that Douglas issued instructions that towns and Indian reserves were to be marked out throughout the whole of the mainland colony. The instructions were conveyed to Moody by the governor's acting private secretary, Charles Good, in a letter dated the 5th of March, 1861. Good specified that Indian reserves were to be marked out as indicated by the Indians themselves. These instructions clearly did not apply to the lands surveyed by Trutch in 1859, containing the Cowichan summer fishing village of Tluctinas, as those lands had already been legally offered for sale at public auction on the 9th of February 1861, and were now legally available for private purchase by settlers. And this is a note on verso of Charles Good's letter to Moody, summarizing the letter's contents. Douglas' instructions about marking of Indian reserves was not given to Moody until the 5th of March, 1861. So here's a transcript of the handwritten letter. Sir, I'm directed by His Excellency the Governor to request that you will take measures so as soon as may be practicable for marking out distinctly the sites of proposed towns and the Indian reserves throughout the colony. The extent of the Indian reserves to be defined as they may be severally pointed out by the Indians themselves. I have the honor to be, sir, your most obedient servant, Charles Good, Acting Private Secretary to the Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works. The court's findings concerning Moody's instructions to the magistrates on the 3rd of May, 1859, were based on speculation. In paragraph 921 of her decision, Madam Justice Young wrote, on May the 3rd, 1859, in advance of Trutch's survey, Moody directed magistrates to prevent Indigenous people from settling down on any part of the ground near or downriver from the town of Queensborough and beyond it. He said, "In case any families should have already done so, you will be good enough to give them notice and to see that they remove, as they are likely to become troublesome if suffered to remain in the immediate neighborhood. This may account in part for the decrease in size and usage of the Cowichan village." Madam Justice Young's speculation that Moody's direction to the magistrates was motivated by his knowledge of Trutch's incoming survey is contradicted by the fact that Trutch did not arrive from England until a month later, in June 1859, and Madam Justice Young had no evidence before her that Moody was even aware that Trutch was coming to the colony. It seems more likely Moody's direction to the magistrates to give Indians notice to remove was motivated by the fact that Queensborough, on the eastern tip of Lulu Island, was shortly thereafter designated as a military reserve for the defense of the new capital city of New Westminster. So here we have the red arrow indicating Queensborough across the Fraser River from New Westminster. The court's findings concerning Moody's instructions to the magistrates on the 3rd of May, 1859, were based on speculation. Continued. Similarly, it is mere speculation on Madam Justice Young's part that Moody's 1859 direction to the magistrates that Indians were to be given notice to remove was the reason for the diminished size of the Cowichan summer fishing village of Cluctinus. The court had evidence before it, which established a different reason for the fact that in 1859 the Cowichan fishing village of Cluctinus occupied only a small portion of Section 23 of the Cowichan claim area. Ovide Allard's statement that the Cowichan had gotten out of the habit of going to Cluctinus. The Cowichan had gotten out of the habit of going to Cluctinus before 1857. Madam Justice Young found that the Cowichan continued to occupy their village at Cluctinus and its surrounding lands during the 1850s and 1860s. This finding contradicts evidence the court had before it, that the Cowichan had gotten out of the habit of going to Cluctinus before 1857. The evidence of Ovide Allard was that formerly all the tribes, not just the Cowichan, frequented the Fraser River, but since the establishment of Fort Victoria and Nanaimo, they had gotten out of the habit. The Cowichan had thus abandoned Cluctinus for an indeterminate period of years prior to the issuance of Governor Douglas' 1861 instructions concerning the marking out of Indian reserves. And so this is Ovide Allard's evidence that the Cowichan had gotten out of the habit of going to the Fraser River. Was Ovide Allard's evidence reliable? According to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, Allard joined the Hudson's Bay Company in 1834 and was among the party that established the first Hudson Bay post in BC at Fort Langley. In 1853, he was sent to Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, where the company was developing its coal deposits, where he remained for 5 years, superintending the Indian Cowichan laborers. According to an article in the BC Historical Quarterly, Ovide Allard married the sister of the great Tyee of the Cowichan Confederacy, Chief Choshia. As a result of matrilineal succession, their son Jason Allard was Choshia's hereditary successor and was treated as such by the Cowichan in his lifetime. Considering these circumstances, it is difficult to think of someone who is in a better position to know what the Cowichan were doing in 1857 than Ovide Allard, and the court erred in not relying on his evidence that the Cowichan had voluntarily stopped going to Cluctinus after the establishment of Fort Victoria and Nanaimo. There could thus have been no reason for either Douglas or Moody to consider marking out a reserve for the Cowichan at Cluctinus in 1861, since the Cowichan themselves had abandoned it. The court accepted the unhistorical Brealey map. Instead of accepting Ovid Allard's evidence that the Cowichan had voluntarily abandoned Clutinus in the 1850s, and the evidence in the Trutch survey that the only portion of the Cowichan claim area in which there was an Indian village in 1859 was a small part of Section 23, Madam Justice Young awarded the Cowichan Aboriginal title over some 800 acres on Lulu Island. This error appears to have been based on the court's acceptance of the unhistorical map compiled by Dr. Kenneth Brealey, which depicts a double row of houses stretching along the length of the Cowichan claim area on the bank of the Fraser River, which was clearly not the case in the 1859 when the claim area was surveyed. Dr. Brealey's evidence was admitted despite the fact that he was not cross-examined on his qualifications and he died before the trial. So this is the Brealey map included as Schedule A in the Cowichan decision. In summary, where did the court go wrong in its analysis? As indicated in the foregoing discussion, the court applied a morally reprehensible test for Aboriginal title and made findings that the honour of the Crown was engaged in 1853 and breached in 1861 and 1863 by nefarious dealing, which are unsupported by the evidence. Other errors could be mentioned, such as the court's dismissal of the probative evidence of longtime Hudson Bay Company factor John Work. Work was with the HBC expedition which traveled down the south arm of the Fraser River in 1824. The evidence Work recorded in his journal places the terrible large village where the party camped at a different location from where the court locates Clutinus. At paragraph 763, Madam Justice Young wrote, on December 19th, 1824, Work described the place where they camped as not far from the entrance of the river. The next day, they continued their course downriver. Mr. Leyland agreed that Work would most likely have been estimating measurements in statute miles. Work likely would have been using a compass. If Work's estimate of the distance was accurate at 11 miles to the Fraser River, then the village seen would not have been in the claim area. However, Mr. Leyland qualified that estimating distances from a canoe is extremely difficult. I accept that the estimates of distances from a canoe may not have been accurate. Madam Justice Young's dismissal of Work's evidence appears arbitrary. Had she given Work's evidence due consideration, the Cowichan case would likely have had a very different outcome. And note, this fellow's name is known as John Work and John Wark. Where did the court go wrong in its analysis? Continued. In paragraph 1756, Madam Justice Young states that an expert witness for the Cowichan, Dr. Dorothy Kennedy, was cross-examined about two key dates in the timeline, the 20th September 1859 and the 6th of October 1859, on the basis of documents which were not in evidence. It seems Dr. Kennedy's testimony on the documents which were not in evidence and which involved matters highly germane to the Trutch survey should have been inadmissible. So Dr. Kennedy gave testimony on documents which were not in evidence. Where else did the court go wrong in its analysis? Other points could be mentioned, including the fact that Madam Justice Young's finding that she was compelled to make a declaration of Aboriginal title because of the Cowichan's deep attachment to their Stulnups, including Clutinus, is belied by their voluntary abandonment of Clutinus in the 1850s and their willingness to sell their lands on Vancouver Island to the Crown in 1850. In paragraph 1208, Madam Justice Young wrote, in 1850, Douglas advised that the Cowichan wished to sell their land to the Crown on the basis they would not be disturbed in the possession of their village sites and would be at liberty to continue hunting and fishing as they did before the arrival of settlers. Though Douglas was not in a position to buy the land, he anticipated that the Indians would be claiming payment for their land in the future. Since the Cowichan decision was handed down on the 7th of August, 2025, Indian activist leaders have claimed that the Cowichan do not want the private property over which Aboriginal title has been declared. If that is the case, why did they convince Madam Justice Young at trial that the land itself was so vitally important to them that they must regain physical possession of it through a declaration of Aboriginal title? And why have they asked in an appeal of her decision for a declaration of Aboriginal title over an additional 1,000 acres in the claim area, which she did not grant them at trial? For all of the above reasons, and more which could be adduced, it's evident that the only appropriate remedy is for the Court of Appeal to order a new trial. So that's the research of Nina Green, showing insights as to whether or not the Cowichan case was wrongly decided. I hope this information is useful. Many people's properties are at risk, and it doesn't appear that there's been a strong defense on behalf of the province for the citizens who now have property in question. Please share this information with your colleagues and friends and family, and consider the insights and historical evidence that Nina has found. Thanks for watching this video.